In 2018, it was announced that Titanic 2 will be constructed and sent across the Atlantic Ocean on the same course as its famous namesake. More than 100 years after the sinking of the passenger liner Titanic, people all over the world still know the name Titanic and have a basic understanding of what happened on that night in April of 1912. It was a tragedy that became almost a legend in its own right. There are many things that are still unknown about what happened, giving rise to wild speculation, numerous conspiracy theories, and imaginative stories. Too often, the truths are lost to the myth and fiction that surround the real event. The thing to remember about the Titanic is that there are many truths to the story, because there were thousands of people on board the ship. Each person had their own perspective, their own story. Some of those stories have survived over the years, some have been embellished, and others have been entirely forgotten. However, when thinking about the worst known maritime disaster in history, it is impossible not to think about all the lives lost in a single night. One of the wealthiest men alive, and the wealthiest passenger aboard the ship, died in the same accident that took the life of a baby younger than 5 months old in steerage. The rules that were meant to govern an accident were not familiar to the crew. Coupled with an inadequate number of lifeboats for the number of passengers, there was no chance that every passenger on the ship would survive its impact with an iceberg in the middle of the night. With fewer than 1,000 survivors out of over 2,500 passengers and crew, the stories from those hours following the collision with the iceberg are haunting. Some of the survivors could not talk about what happened. Others were willing to relive the night to help remember the lives lost. Some of the survivors were shunned for the rest of their lives because they were men, and with so many women and children dead following the sinking of the ship, it was seen as wrong for the men to have taken their places in the lifeboats. Many of the survivors were remembered more for having survived the tragedy than for any other accomplishments they had in life. The tragedy was avoidable, as the problems that led to so many deaths were well known by those who worked on ships. One man even wrote a story 14 years before the catastrophe, resulting in people believing that he could predict the future. In reality, the tragedy was an inevitability because the laws and regulations at the time were based on the belief that nothing bad would happen, instead of working to ensure that all the passengers were safe. Ultimately, the maritime catastrophe resulted in changes to the way transportation companies and regulators considered life-saving measures. However, the price for this change was far too high. More than 100 years after the disaster, the survivors have passed on, but they left behind harrowing stories that remind us that every day is something to appreciate. No matter how safe or certain people are, there are always things that can go wrong. These stories include love, loss, hope, failure, and everything in between. It is the tales told by those who survived that convey the feelings of that fateful night and the reality of the lives lost.